et sa main à eye. Ja'ahabila examil. The skeleton tried to move, but its fragile body only trembled. The powerlessness in the face of the situation was evident in every bone that vibrated with fear. Without any chance of defense, it was violently thrown into the air, completely at the mercy of the brute force that had struck it. The demoness watched the scene, and shock took over her expression as she realized the cruel and inevitable fate that awaited her companion. In an act of sacrifice, she stepped in the way of the attack. The knight's blade cut into her flesh, causing blood to spurt as she desperately tried to block the blow. Even shattered and on the ground, the skeleton stretched out its arms, trying to reach something or someone, driven by a will that transcended its limited physical form. However, the knight's brutality was relentless. The weight of the shield came down with crushing force, pressing the creature against the merciless ground. The impact was devastating. The bone structure could not withstand the pressure and shattered, scattering fragments in an explosion of violence. The force of the blow separated the skull from the rest of the body. The woman, wounded and thrown back, watched in horror at the final dismemberment of her ally. Fallen and severely wounded, she struggled to breathe. Tears mixed with blood on her face. As exhaustion and pain consumed her, the skull rested on the cold ground, now still and silent, devoid of the life and determination it had shown moments before. A painful memory invaded her mind. The feeling of guilt was overwhelming, deeply regretting her inability to have protected that fragile being. With her gaze fixed on the remains of her companion, the pain of loss seemed to outweigh the agony of her own physical wounds. The knight stood before them, watching the result of his attack with an expression of superiority and disdain. The skull rolled once more across the stone floor, stopping definitively as a macabre trophy of that unequal battle. Far from feeling any remorse, the warrior laughed openly. The cruelty of the situation and the suffering of his opponents seemed only to amuse him. The severed head rolled across the cold floor, stopping far from the rest of the shattered body. Defeat seemed absolute. The knight, however, widened his eyes, seized by a sudden and painful surprise. A sharp scream escaped his throat as he bent over, feeling a stabbing pain in his foot. Even reduced to just a skull, the skeleton had sunk its teeth into the flesh of the enemy in a last desperate act of defiance. The bite, however, was not enough. The skull came loose and fell, still and helpless, as the knight's blood stained the ground. Furious at the creature's audacity, the warrior brought down his heavy boot with brutal violence to crush what was left of the opponent. The darkness of death was suddenly replaced by the dizzying sight of treetops under a cloudy sky. The skeleton rose, stunned, watching its own hands. It was whole again, not understanding how this was possible. Looking around from inside the shallow grave, it questioned its own sanity, wondering if it was all just a vivid dream. Upon exiting, it came across a hooded figure in the rain. An unsettling sense of familiarity took over it. A luminous interface appeared before its eyes, informing it that its abilities and level had returned to the initial stage. The young woman under the hood revealed her face and began to speak, oblivious to the internal confusion of the creature she had just summoned. She introduced herself as Rubia, solemnly declaring that she had awakened the skeleton from its deep slumber. The skeleton stared at her, static. Those words and that face confirmed the impossible. It had returned to the past. Before it stood the same woman, at the exact moment it had first awakened, years ago. The skeleton steadied its hand on the damp ground. It needed to feel the texture of the earth to confirm that this was real. Rising under the storm, the creature processed the impossibility of its situation. It had returned 20 years into the past. The doubt, however, still persisted in its mind. The skeleton questioned whether it was all just one last dream before the end. The hooded young woman, oblivious to its mental whirlwind, tried to rationalize the silence. She concluded that the invocation was simply not able to speak. Suddenly, a bloody memory invaded the undead's consciousness. It recalled the tragic fate of a woman identical to the one standing before it. the skeleton fixed its gaze on the empty sockets. The connection between the painful past and the miraculous present became undeniable. Innocent about the dark future that awaited her, the girl offered a shy and gentle smile. Driven by an uncontrollable impulse, the skeleton ignored any etiquette. It pulled the surprised young woman into a desperate and sudden embrace. The girl was stunned by the creature's audacity. As she reacted with confusion, it internally reaffirmed its oath to protect her this time. The skeleton's jaw clenched tightly. The intensity of its emotions threatened to overwhelm its new physical form. Then, something impossible happened. A dark fluid trickled from its eye sockets. As if the bone itself wept with relief and sorrow, the young woman shuddered, noticing his reaction. She realized that this wasn't a common monster, but someone capable of feeling deep pain. The moment became too intense for her. Embarrassed and nervous, the girl stammered, asking him to put her down. For the skeleton, letting her go seemed inconceivable at that moment. He understood that, without her presence, this new life would have no meaning. The young woman's request finally broke his trance. The creature seemed to awaken from his emotional reverie, noticing the confusion he had caused. The system announced the start of an S-class scenario centered on Rei Rubia. In the torrential rain, the young necromancer and her creature's ordeal had begun. The skeleton carried the girl on his back, advancing through the storm. As they walked, he pondered her identity and the strange connection the system indicated. A status window appeared before him, detailing Rei's abilities. The system revealed that despite being a novice necromancer, she already harbored feelings of adaptation for her invocation. The girl, however, seemed restless. Her eyes scanned the forest with apprehension, mentally questioning if they were the only ones present in that dangerous place. Rei tried to remain optimistic while being carried, forcing a nervous smile. She knew that this wasn't the time to show weakness, despite the evident fear. Suddenly, the skeleton stopped in his tracks. The undead creature noticed something in the surroundings that had escaped the girl's human senses. The sound of rain was cut by the heavy breathing of an animal. A horse was nearby, betraying the imminent arrival of strangers. Two horsemen emerged from the vegetation, intercepting the path. The pair was discovered by the travelers before they could avoid the confrontation. The skeleton remained still, coldly analyzing the situation. He needed to calculate the chances of survival and the nature of this new threat. One of the men, carrying a heavy weapon, pointed in their direction with suspicion. He seemed confused, trying to recall if he had seen those figures before. The protagonist immediately identified the level of danger. They were armed professional mercenaries, and a quick scan confirmed that there was no one else in sight to ambush them. To the pair's surprise, the mercenaries decided to turn back. They complained about the difficulty of the scenario and the search for the girl, ironically ignoring that the target was right there. As soon as the men moved away, Rei released the air she was holding in her lungs. The relief of not having been recognized was immediate, although the girl was still trembling from the tension. However, the necromancer's calm soon turned to astonishment. She noticed a sudden change in her invocation's behavior that left her perplexed. Rei moved abruptly away from the skeleton, visibly shaken. She confronted the creature, demanding explanations about the absurd communication she had just received from him. Suddenly, a bolt cut through the air and struck Rei Rubia violently in the shoulder. The surprise attack tinged the moment with urgency and pain. The skeleton reacted instantly to the sound of the impact, turning sharply to identify the origin of that cowardly aggression. The bold mercenary emerged from the rain with a sadistic smile, mocking the situation and treating his victims as mere guests for death. In the distance, the shooter maintained his position, revealing that the apparent previous indifference had been just a tactic to make them lower their guard. The young woman paled, the shock of the injury mixing with the dread of realizing that they had fallen into a deadly trap. The accomplice smiled maliciously, proud of his deception, confirming that the momentary safety had been nothing more than a cruel farce. Rei pressed her hand against her wounded shoulder, feeling the sharp pain as she tried to remain conscious in the face of imminent danger. The bandit approached arrogantly, ridiculing the girl's noble lineage and making it clear that here in the forest titles would not save her. The man's gaze became predatory, focusing on his defenseless prey with intentions that went far beyond simple robbery. However, while the mercenary reveled in his own villainy, the skeleton silently appeared behind him, raising a massive stone for a fatal blow. Ray watched the scene with wide eyes, astonished by the sudden brutality and the unexpected protection coming from the monster. With the threat neutralized, the creature extended his skeletal hand in a surprisingly human and gentle gesture. The skeleton knelt before her like a sworn knight, offering assistance with a solemn and protective reverence. The heiress stared at that gesture, confused and hesitant, trying to understand the loyalty demonstrated by that undead creature. But time was short. The skeleton urged her to act immediately, as the survival of both depended on the speed of their escape. A sudden and violent impact struck the side of the skeleton's skull, shaking his consciousness. The dry sound of the collision echoed in the air, marking an abrupt interruption in the moment. The undead remained static, visibly stunned and without immediate reaction to the attack. His mind, however, was transported to a recent memory, recalling the instant he rose from a solitary tomb. On that occasion, the skeleton felt completely disoriented, sweating cold as he tried to understand his new reality. Elris also ikt sexmal. The silence of that awakening was broken by a female voice shouting to get his attention. A young woman in a green cloak revealed herself in the rain, introducing herself as Rubia and taking responsibility for his awakening. She opened her arms solemnly, declaring her identity and establishing herself as the summoner. Rubia approached, emphasizing that she had intentionally interrupted the creature's eternal sleep. The newly awakened being stared at his own bony hands, confronting the undeniable proof of his transformation. Fallen and confused, he internally questioned the nature of his rebirth and the unusual strength he seemed to possess. Doubts filled the void in his mind as he tried to process that absurd information. He tried to compose himself, seeking to understand what that woman expected of him. The skeleton looked at his own body once more, still in disbelief at his current condition. However, his reverie was brutally ended when reality struck him again with another physical blow. The skeleton remained motionless in the rain, newly awakened. His mind, still confused, tried to process the reality of that dark forest. As he observed his own body, an urgent message appeared in his vision. He immediately understood that he needed to move fast to survive. His heightened senses picked up something in the environment. With a sharp movement, the creature turned its skull, alerted by a nearby presence. Before him stood a hooded young woman. She laughed nervously and scratched her head, trying to dispel the embarrassment of that unusual encounter. The girl seemed confused by the lack of communication. The situation was too strange, creating a moment of hesitation about how to interact with the creature. The skeleton, however, ignored protocol. He held out his hand and pointed decisively to a nearby rock, indicating a safe location. The young woman in the green hood widened her eyes in surprise. She didn't expect her invocation to take command in such an assertive manner. He warned her about the imminent approach of human mercenaries. Despite her disbelief, the creature insisted that she trust him and hide. Rey Rubia fell silent, bringing her hand to her mouth as she processed the warning. The information weighed on her, transforming her initial confusion into concern. She tried to question how he knew that. The surprise on her face made it clear that such perspicacity was not normal for a simple undead, but the creature offered no further explanations. His rigid posture indicated that there was no room for doubts or debates at that critical moment. He cut off her curiosity with a direct and final order. The only safe option for the summoner was to obey without questioning. The young woman stared at him, tense and sweating cold. She needed to quickly decide whether to blindly trust the instructions of that mysterious being. The skeleton then turned, ready to intercept the threat. His attention shifted entirely from the girl to the danger approaching through the forest. Rey watched him with a mixture of fear and astonishment. She realized at that moment that the situation had completely spiraled out of her control. The skeleton noticed the weapon sheathed at the young woman's waist. He pointed to the object, indicating that he needed it. His posture was firm and demanding. To ensure her safety against what was to come, that blade was essential. Rei hesitated for a moment, pondering whether she should hand over her only defense to a newly awakened creature. Deciding to trust the bond they had formed, she handed over the sword. The skeleton accepted the weapon, silently thanking her for the cooperation. Following his instructions, the young woman ran to hide among the rocks, leaving the path clear for the confrontation. Alone now, the undead turned his face in the direction of the sound. The trap was ready to be set. The pursuers emerged from the rainy forest. Knights and mercenaries scoured the area, certain they would find their prey there. The man with the crossbow looked around, confused. There was no sign of the girl, just the incessant rain and the empty forest. One of the mercenaries, irritated by the fruitless search, cursed and reached for the weapon on his back, feeling that something was wrong. He walked arrogantly, passing right by what he thought was just an old carcass on the ground, insulting the fugitive's cunning. The mercenary made a fatal mistake. The skeleton lay motionless, feigning death, but with his hand firmly clenched on the hilt of the sword. While the man questioned where the girl had gone, Death rose silently behind him, preparing the blow. The assassin's instinct alerted him to the danger behind him, and his eyes widened in pure shock. The attack was quick and lethal. The enemy collapsed into a pool of blood, and the system immediately rewarded the skeleton with new power. Victorious, the skeleton observed the result of his ambush. The first threat had been eliminated with brutal efficiency. The impact of the previous attack still resonated, kicking up dust and debris around the battlefield. The mercenary, furious, wasted no time and brought his hammer down on the fallen opponent's skull. However, confusion took over his face as he noticed the unusual resistance of that creature. He loudly questioned the skeleton's origin, trying to figure out if he was facing a dungeon monster. The protagonist, Fallen, realized that the difference in physical strength was still overwhelming and dangerous. The man raised his weapon for the final blow, declaring his intention to grind the bones to dust. However, a system window flashed before the skeleton, revealing the reward for the defeated enemy. Without hesitation, he accessed his attributes and distributed the new available points to ensure his survival. A projectile suddenly cut through the air, bringing with it a lethal and swift threat. The feeling of imminent death echoed in his mind, a cold certainty that this would be the end. But he reacted. With supernatural speed, the skeleton dodged the hammer and the imminent danger. The mercenary broke out in a cold sweat, his eyes wide with shock as he struck only empty air. The sudden increase in level and agility transformed the skeleton, allowing him to overcome previous limits. The human's vision spun violently as his head separates from his body in a clean cut. The skeleton landed behind the defeated enemy, while the mercenary, now on the ground, questioned how this was possible. The mercenary froze, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. He realized too late that the creature in front of him was not easy prey, but a lethal threat. The words died in his throat. The shock of seeing his companion eliminated so quickly left him momentarily paralyzed and unable to react. The skeleton didn't waste the opportunity. With his newly acquired agility, he advanced against the terrified human before any defense could be mounted. The body of bones moved with mechanical precision. Each joint worked in unison to maximize the force of the impending attack. In an act of pure reflex, the man tried to raise his weapon. However, the movement was slow and clumsy compared to the undead's swift charge. The distance was closed. The mercenary was completely exposed, his armor offering little protection against the angle of the approaching attack. The skeleton delivered the blow with violence. The impact was quick and devastating, piercing the opponent's defenses as if they didn't exist. Blood spurted into the air as the blade found its target. The attack was fatal, executed with a brutal efficiency that left no room for survival. Life instantly abandoned the mercenary's gaze. He fell, defeated by a force he had completely underestimated. Under the storm, the man fell to his knees before his executioner. the skeleton remained standing, victorious, as the thunder echoed the end of the combat. The lifeless body collapsed into the mud with a heavy thud. Silence returned to the forest, broken only by the sound of rain falling on the corpses. The protagonist observed the result of his efforts. He had managed to overcome the difference in strength and skill, achieving success in his risky strategy. Rare Rubia, who was watching everything hidden, was pale. Fear and surprise were etched on her face as she witnessed the brutality and effectiveness of that skeletal being. She let out a long sigh of relief, leaning on the rock to avoid falling. The tension of the moment dissipated, replaced by the exhaustion of having escaped death. The skeleton raised its skull to the rainy sky. He felt a deep satisfaction, realizing that he had finally obtained the power necessary to protect himself and others. Fresh blood trickled slowly down the blade of the sword, marking the silence that followed the end of the brutal combat. The skeleton remained motionless among the corpses of the defeated mercenaries. Rey Rubia stared at her savior's back, stunned by the violence she had just witnessed. The young woman's gaze met the creature's. The initial fear was now mixed with the confusion of having been protected by an undead. That moment brought back old memories for the protagonist. He remembered when he emerged from his own grave for the first time, confused and weak. The system manifested before him, displaying his updated attributes and status. He quickly analyzed the information about its evolution before proceeding. Noticing the uncomfortable silence, the skeleton tried to initiate a verbal interaction to calm the girl and show that he was not a threat. He tried to appear harmless, although his bony and fixed expression made it difficult to convey any warm emotion. They continued their journey through the interior of a dark cave. Rey walked right behind, mentally questioning the strange attitudes of that creature. The young woman couldn't help but react, with skepticism and slight irritation. The situation was too absurd to be accepted without question. As they advanced through the darkness, Rey decided to share her story. She began to talk about the loss of her mother and the integrity of her father. Her story revealed the kingdom's political landscape. The rise of a new warmongering king had drastically changed the rules, favoring violence and war. Her father, a moderate lord who resisted the new orders, ended up suffering the brutal consequences of maintaining his honor in the face of the new regime. Rey clearly recalled the moment she witnessed her father's defeat and deplorable state. The powerlessness in the face of that situation marked her memory. The memory of her family's suffering brought up a deep anguish. The despair of that time still consumed her from within. In the present, tears streamed down Rey's face again. Reliving the painful past while walking in the darkness exposed her emotional fragility. Rey wept quietly, the memories of the past weighing on her. The skeleton, in turn, watched the scene in silence, pondering the delicate situation they were in. Tears continued to fall down the young woman's face. The pain of loss and the complexity of her destiny seemed unbearable in that moment of vulnerability. The undead broke the silence, reflecting on the cruelty of the world. He commented with some cynicism how innocents ended up sacrificed or trapped in the middle of larger conflicts they couldn't control. Rey looked up, surprised by his analysis. The skeleton internally recognized his limitations to stop a war, but made a silent commitment to protect that girl from now on. Hearing those words, the young woman wiped away her tears. A slight smile appeared on her face, finding comfort and hope in the unexpected determination of her strange guardian. For the skeleton, however, there was a hidden motivation. Looking at Rey, he remembered his former mistress. Protecting the human was a necessary step to, who knows, meet the demon again one day. With renewed spirits, they decided on the next step. A torch was lit to illuminate the path, as they agreed that they needed to reach a nearby village as soon as possible. The pair advanced through the darkness of the cave. The silence was now filled only by the sound of their footsteps, echoing on the cold stone walls as they followed the light of the torch. The heavy atmosphere from before dissipated. Rey Rubia, feeling safer, even let out a discreet laugh, finding amusement in the unusual company and personality of that skeletal being. The walk continued with determination. Step by step, they left the depths of the cave behind, moving hastily towards the exit. Suddenly, an intense light invaded the tunnel. The sudden brightness caught them both by surprise, blinding them momentarily and signaling the end of that underground passage. Upon reaching the open air, the skeleton oriented himself in the mountainous landscape. He carried the belongings and encouraged his companion, warning that their destination was near and she just needed to hold on a little longer. The terrain outside was steep and treacherous. The hooded young woman struggled to maintain her balance and pace as they climbed over the difficult rocks. Exhaustion almost overcame her, causing her to stumble on the rough path. Promptly, the skeleton reacted and supported her, serving as physical support to prevent her from falling. Together, they continued the march through the desolate landscape. The bone warrior and the fugitive noblewoman moved forward, united by the need for survival in that hostile environment. Ray pointed to the horizon with optimism. She indicated that their destination, Yublam, was just ahead. Observing the distant fortress, the young woman commented with relief that they had managed to get there by the skin of their teeth. The landscape changed drastically as they climbed. Enchanted, Ray ran ahead, marveling at the snow that covered the path. The skeleton remained still, just watching the sudden change in his companion's behavior. Suddenly, a snowball hit him squarely in the face, shattering against the bone. Ray couldn't contain her laughter at the scene. She found the image of the undead covered in snow funny and made fun of the situation. The skeleton remained motionless, with the snow stuck in his empty sockets, showing no immediate reaction. An awkward silence hung in the air, broken only by the crows. He decided to ignore the childish prank and accept the situation with resignation. The journey continued, now more arduous. The cold wind blew as they advanced along the mountainous and lonely trails. The terrain became steep and dangerous. While struggling to climb, Ray confirmed if this was really the correct path to Yublam. Exhausted, the young woman stopped to catch her breath. She suggested that upon arrival, they should buy armor to disguise him better. The skeleton, however, was focused on safety. He reprimanded her, warning that acting carelessly would attract unwanted attention to them. However, the distraction took its toll. Ray's foot slipped on the treacherous surface of the rock. Balance was lost in an instant. Fear was etched on her face as she realized the imminent fall. The skeleton reacted instantly. He lunged towards her before the worst happened. The skeleton acted with quick reflexes, firmly holding Ray's hand before she plunged into the abyss. The fall would be fatal, but he made sure she didn't fall. With a strong pull, he hoisted her back to the safety of the snowy slope. Loose stones rolled down the mountain as he brought her to solid ground. Ray regained her balance, still stunned by the scare. The adrenaline of the moment left her momentarily speechless in the face of the danger she had just avoided. Both collapsed in the snow to catch their breath after the sudden effort. Still panting, the young woman expressed her sincere gratitude to her silent companion. A genuine smile lit up Ray's face. She looked at the creature and recognized, with affection, that he was always ready to protect her, no matter the situation. Focused on the mission, the skeleton reached out its bony hand to retrieve the supply backpack that had been left on the ground. Before them, the ancient fortress stood imposing against the sky. The wind blew around the stone towers, indicating that they had reached their destination. Ray made a strategic decision. She turned to the skeleton and announced that she would enter the building alone, ensuring it would be a quick incursion. The young woman tried to reassure him, downplaying the dangers of the task. She assured him that it was nothing compared to the challenges they had already overcome. With a cheerful wave, Ray said goodbye and ran towards the castle. She promised to return soon, leaving her guardian behind on the path. The skeleton remained still on the path, the backpack on its shoulder. It watched silently as its charge walked away alone. However, something interrupted its vigil. The creature tilted its skull sharply, as if it had noticed a strange sound or presence nearby. It didn't remain still. Moving stealthily through the vegetation near the walls, the skeleton began to observe the perimeter upon hearing voices of complaint. An old hooded man pushed a wooden cart, cursing bitterly against his leader and the thankless task he had been forced to perform. Meanwhile, in a dark and isolated environment, Ray's expression crumbled into sadness. Silent tears streamed down her face, revealing deep anguish. The skeleton walked through the forest, the rhythmic sound of its footsteps marking the passage of time on the lonely road. A recent memory surfaced, her gentle smile and the gratitude she expressed for him, always protecting her from danger. Suddenly the walk ceased. It stopped short, feeling that something had changed drastically behind it. The memory of her liveliness, waving under the open sky, contrasted cruelly with the reality of the present moment. The skeleton remained still under the orange light of dusk, processing the sudden silence that had settled in. The young woman's body had collapsed. She fell heavily to the ground behind him, exhausted and without the strength to continue the journey. It stood before its fallen companion, becoming a silent sentinel against the twilight. The empty sockets of its skull seemed to watch the horizon, but its attention was focused on something much darker. The demoness who had once fought by its side now seemed like just an empty shell, her eyes without the spark of life. She was completely vulnerable, fallen at the mercy of anyone who passed by on the road at that critical moment, and it wasn't long before the threat revealed itself. Two men appeared on the path, walking carelessly towards them. The skeleton turned its head, detecting the approach of the strangers who were invading its moment of vigil. The men stopped, observing the scene with total disdain. One of them spat on the ground, demonstrating his lack of empathy. The mercenary mocked the creature's defensive posture, ridiculing its loyalty and comparing it to a rabid dog. The other man only lamented the loss of merchandise, irritated that she had perished before they could profit from her sale. The skeleton watched silently through the foliage. Two men stopped on the road, arguing about the girl's fallen body. The creature remained still, analyzing the situation. It needed to assess the level of danger before revealing its presence. One of the strangers questioned his companion's intentions. He seemed reluctant and shocked by what the other planned to do. The hooded man, however, justified his greed and lust. For him, leaving the young woman there would be a waste of an opportunity. His partner insulted him, calling him crazy. The girl remained unconscious, unable to defend herself from the evil that surrounded her. Ignoring the warning, the bandit advanced with a low laugh. His predatory instincts took over. A grotesque smile twisted his face. The certainty of impunity made him euphoric in the face of her vulnerability. He positioned himself over the young woman with pink hair. He believed he was alone and free to satisfy his basest desires. The metallic sound of the buckle being undone echoed. He began to unbutton his belt, preparing to commit the abuse. Excitement completely blinded him. Focused only on his imminent pleasure, he lost all sense of what was happening around him. As he leaned over the victim, death arose silently behind him. The skeleton approached without making a sound. Skeletal fingers tightened on the hilt of the fallen sword. The decision to attack was made without hesitation. The blade pierced the aggressor's body violently. The blow was precise, piercing him from back to front before he could react. A scream of agony broke the silence of the forest. The shock of pain instantly replaced his sickly smile. Blood flowed as life ebbed away. The skeleton stood firm close to the dying man's ear, ensuring that this was his last mistake. XML. The surviving mercenary stared at the scene in total shock. He yelled, demanding to know the identity of who had attacked them so suddenly. The blade remained lodged in the first attacker's back. The skeleton maintained the pressure, ensuring the wounded enemy had no chance to react. The remaining man cursed, sweating profusely. He realized too late that the situation had spiraled completely out of his control. The undead creature fixed its empty gaze on the survivor. Its silent presence demanded immediate comprehension of the gravity of the moment. Faced with the lethal threat, the mercenary raised his hands in surrender. Fear made him recoil, desperately trying to negotiate his safety. The skeleton maintained its dominant position over the first man's body. He demanded to know why the young woman had been left in that vulnerable state. Desperate to save his own skin, the bandit began to speak. He swore they had only received her from someone else and knew nothing more. The skeleton's attention turned momentarily to his wounded companion. The priority was to discover the name of the one responsible for this cruelty. The man continued to gesture frantically, pointing away. He insisted they were just following superior orders, trying to absolve himself of any blame. The skull watched carefully from behind an obstacle. There was no mercy in its posture, just a cold analysis of the justifications presented. Without the strength to fight or flee, the mercenary collapsed to the ground. The skeleton rose above him, with the bloody sword ready in its grip. The man shuddered, paralyzed by terror. He knew he was at the mercy of something he didn't fully understand. Suddenly, it dawned on him. His eyes widened as he noticed the true nature of the being beneath the tattered cloak. The blade descended mercilessly. The steel pierced the mercenary's body, cutting off his breath and silencing his excuses forever. As life ebbed away, the man babbled his last words. He died in disbelief upon realizing that his executioner was, in fact, a simple skeleton. The skeleton remained motionless over the bodies of the defeated mercenaries. Beside them, the young red-haired woman remained unconscious, unaware of the massacre that had just occurred to protect her. The creature watched the horizon with its empty sockets glowing purple. The battle was over, but the quiet of the forest brought a new, immediate concern. He began to move, his steps echoing unnaturally in the silent environment. There was something that needed to be checked before any other decision. The skeleton tilted its head, focusing its attention entirely on the fallen woman. The priority now was to assess the condition of his only ally. Carefully, he knelt beside the inert body, his skeletal hand extended, hovering over her face in a gesture of verification. The bone fingers touched the young woman's skin, seeking vital signs or trying to wake her. The cold, rigid touch contrasted with the fragility of the moment. Realizing that she would not wake up immediately, the skeleton stood up, keeping the sword close. He concluded that he needed to seek help or shelter, as staying there was not safe. Sometime later, under the moonlight, a hooded figure entered the streets of a nearby village. The disguise was necessary to move among humans without causing immediate panic. A local resident opened the door, intrigued by the nocturnal visit. His expression changed from curiosity to confusion as he stared at the stranger in front of him. The reception, however, was violent. Skeletal hands emerged from the robes and grabbed the man with crushing force, ignoring any attempt at peaceful dialogue. The man was thrown into the house, falling awkwardly onto the wooden floor. The hooded figure remained at the entrance, imposing its terrifying presence. Fear transfigured the resident's face. Sweating and trembling, he realized he was dealing with a force far beyond his comprehension or ability to defend himself. He tried to back away, crawling away from the door while looking up. The invader's shadow loomed over him, blocking any escape route. In absolute panic, the man cowered on the floor. Bringing his hands to his head, he began to babble apologies and denials, desperate to convince the invader of his ignorance. The skeleton, hidden by the darkness of the hood, was unmoved by the other's despair. He pressed the man coldly, questioning the veracity of that supposed lack of knowledge. The man, trembling with terror, immediately assumed that the hooded figure was an assassin sent by an organization. He babbled about the Lord's daughter, believing his end had come. In absolute panic, the resident questioned what someone, insignificant like him, could have done to deserve such punishment. Fear clouded his reasoning, making him plead for innocence. The hooded figure, however, remained still. That disjointed conversation about organizations and past crimes made no sense to the skeleton. The invader's unexpected reaction made the man hesitate. He realized, stunned and sweating, that this being might not be the executioner he imagined. With no patience for misunderstandings, the skeleton acted physically. With brute force, he grabbed the man's head and forced it violently against the floor. The skeletal face was revealed under the shadows of the hood. His intention was clear, and the order was direct. The man existed at that moment only to answer questions. Subjugated before the blade stuck in the floor, the prisoner began to speak. He revealed that someone had been taken by the guards, delivering the information the skeleton sought. However, fear gave way to a momentary hesitation. The man seemed to calculate his next words. risking testing his captor's patience with incomplete information. The skeleton's tolerance ran out. The interrogation became more aggressive, and the man found himself facing the blade again, questioned about the reasons for his actions. The instinct for survival spoke louder. In a desperate move, the man tried to back away, crawling away from that terrifying presence while cursing. It was a fatal mistake to try and flee. The bony hand tightened its grip on the sword with lethal precision, ready to punish the insubordination. The blade came down mercilessly, not to kill, but to immobilize. The steel pierced the flesh, pinning the man's leg to the wooden floor. A scream of agony echoed through the room. The man clutched at the bloody wound, realizing too late that there was no escape from that monster. Shock took over his face. The searing pain and dread left him on the verge of collapse with his eyes rolling back and his breathing erratic. The skeleton approached, looming over the helpless victim. Faced with certain death, the man could only pathetically beg for forgiveness. The skeleton questioned the motivations behind the recent events. His menacing stance demanded clear answers about the girl's fate. Keeping the sword steady, he ensured the prisoner remained still. This interrogation wouldn't end until the whole truth was exposed. Terrified, the man caved and began to speak desperately. He revealed that the Necron society demanded women to serve as slaves. The protagonist listened in silence, processing the gravity of that confession. The mention of such a society confirmed his worst fears. However, as soon as the secret was revealed, the man's body reacted. A magical mark on his neck began to glow intensely. The tattoo came to life, materializing as a dark serpent. The seal of silence had been activated to punish the betrayal. The magical creature wrapped around the victim's throat, squeezing with lethal force. There was no escaping that supernatural execution. The skeleton watched the scene, realizing that the curse was a security mechanism. The source of information was being silenced permanently. As life ebbed away, the name of the organization echoed one last time. The Necron Society protected its secrets with death. The skeleton's mind immediately connected the dots. The men who were chasing Rubia and the local guards were all linked to that conspiracy. An understanding of the complete picture formed in his mind. He realized that the network of enemies was much larger than he imagined. Later, in a calmer environment, a full suit of armor was on display. It was the necessary resource for the next steps. The skeleton examined the equipment with interest. To continue his journey without attracting unwanted attention, he would need a new disguise. He recalled Rubia's enthusiastic suggestion. The young woman had insisted that acquiring adequate protection was essential for his safety. Accepting the advice, he prepared to don the metal. That outfit would be his new identity, to face the dangers to come. The skeleton remained still for a moment, processing the weight of what he had just done. The darkness under the hood hid any expression. With the problem solved, the protagonist turned his back on the informant's corpse. There was no time to waste on remorse. His heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. He walked with determination, leaving death and silence behind. The daylight flooded the room as he opened the door. Now, under the imperial armor, his true nature was safe and hidden. Later, deep within the dungeon, the warrior's blade came down violently, cleaving his target in half in a single blow. The impact was brutal. The opponent's structure couldn't withstand the force of the attack and shattered instantly. Only the skull of the defeated creature remained. The victory had been swift, proving the effectiveness of his new equipment. The knight watched the fragments fall. He realized, however, that the durability of that creature was disappointing. With his sword in hand, the protagonist stared at the remains on the ground. That combat test had ended abruptly. The surrounding environment was oppressive and damp. The cave's stalactites looked like sharp teeth, ready to devour any intruder. As he advanced through the darkness, he decided to test a new ability. The system indicated the activation of the mysterious Spectre spell. The warrior awaited the result focused under his helmet. He needed to know what kind of power that magic would grant him. A sound of bones clattering awkwardly caught his attention. He turned slowly to inspect what had materialized. The protagonist was speechless. A wave of confusion and disappointment washed over his mind upon seeing the result. Before him stood a trembling and clumsy skeleton. The creature let out a pathetic groan. Far from the fearsome soldier he had hoped to command, the protagonist scratched his helmet, feeling embarrassed. The awkwardness of his new invocation was disappointing and almost comical. Upon spotting a wild skeleton patrolling the area, the knight decided to try a different approach instead of attacking immediately. He calmly removed his helmet, revealing his true face. His intention was to show solidarity and avoid an unnecessary conflict between brethren. The wild creature froze, visibly confused, upon realizing that this armored warrior was in fact a brother of bones. The protagonist maintained his posture, waiting patiently to see if his gesture of camaraderie would be accepted. The strategy worked perfectly. The wild skeleton, losing interest in fighting an equal, simply turned its back and walked away. The tranquility, however, was shattered by an urgent warning from the system. The dungeon boss had just appeared on the scene. The sudden alert made the protagonist turn around, surprised by the drastic change in the cave's atmosphere. He barely had time to process the information, questioning how the boss could have appeared so suddenly in that sector. A colossal and terrifying figure emerged from the shadows, emanating blue energy and wielding a gigantic mace ready to strike. The small summoned servant, sensing the oppressive aura of that monster, began to tremble uncontrollably, with pure terror. The boss showed no mercy. With a brutal movement, it brought down its weapon and crushed the fragile ally that stood in its way. Chaos took over the corridor as the monster's devastating force violently dispersed any nearby creature. Realizing that diplomacy wouldn't work against that beast, the protagonist hastily put his helmet back on, assuming his combat stance. He reached out urgently. The situation had escalated rapidly, and now he needed to act to survive this massacre. The skeleton advanced with fierce determination, ignoring its own fragility. Energy pulsed in its chest as it launched its attack. Fury took over as it remembered what the knight had done to its companion. It demanded to know the reason for such cruelty against an ally. A guttural scream escaped its bony jaws. It wasn't just an attack, but an act of pure desperation and uncontrollable rage. It jumped on the opponent, brandishing its weapons with all the strength it possessed. The knight, however, defensively prepared to receive the impact. With a fluid movement, the armored warrior dodged the blow. The speed was such that the skeleton's attack only cut through the air. The knight paused for a moment, genuinely surprised. The persistence of that creature seemed to have caught his attention in an unexpected way. The impact forced the human to stumble backward onto the ground. For the first time, the undead's offensive broke the enemy's posture. Without giving respite, the skeleton kept the pressure on the fallen opponent. It would not allow the knight to recover from that moment of vulnerability. The warrior steadied his sword, realizing the creature's murderous intent. He scoffed at the audacity of that being to believe it could defeat him. Another blow was struck with extreme violence. The skeleton charged blindly, driven only by the burning desire for revenge. The heavy weapon came down with crushing force, narrowly missing the target. The ground shook with the impact that should have crushed the knight. Taking advantage of the opening left by the failed attack, the human counter-attacked. His blade drew a quick arc, targeting the monster's exposed structure. The blow connected brutally in the creature's torso. The bone structure shuddered and cracked under the relentless force of the impact. The knight exclaimed with sadistic satisfaction. He seemed to relish the moment when his superiority was confirmed in combat. With a firm stance, he completed the fatal movement. That single counterattack was enough to demonstrate the abysmal difference in power between them. The purple-armored knight was knocked down, and the enemy skeleton took advantage of the opening to deliver a blow that seemed fatal. The creature roared with fury, channeling a blue spectral energy as it pressed the attack, certain of its victory. However, the protagonist reacted coldly. Even on the ground, he intercepted the mace's shaft, stopping the blow with surprising strength. Using the enemy's weapon as support, he propelled his body upward, landing directly on the opponent's skull. The protagonist maintained perfect balance on the creature's shoulders. He knew exactly how to exploit that monster's flaws. The enemy skeleton desperately tried to get rid of the extra weight, but it was already too late to react. With the calmness of an experienced warrior, the protagonist prepared his sword, aiming at the opponent's structural weak point. He raised the blade and brought it down violently, plunging the sword through the enemy's body in a fluid motion. The impact was devastating, cracking the ground and releasing a shockwave that pulverized the opponent's resistance. The force of the blow hurled the enemy skeleton away, defeated and dismembered by the precise attack. With the battle over, system windows appeared in the air. The protagonist watched the evolution notifications glow before him. He removed his helmet, revealing his bare skull. The skeleton was surprised to notice that he had leveled up several times at once. But the surprises weren't over. Something else caught his attention, a new message that demanded immediate focus. A training quest has been initiated. To acquire the swordsmanship skill, he would need to swing his sword 10,000 times. Without wasting time questioning the task, the skeleton steadied his stance and began the first movement, determined to become stronger. The pair suddenly stopped in front of the cave entrance. The surrounding atmosphere felt heavy, suggesting the real challenge was about to begin there. Ray noticed the presence of other adventurers nearby. A warrior was trying to reassure his companion with promises of protection, a scene of normalcy that contrasted with the tension the young noble felt. Meanwhile, the skeleton received a new system notification. The initiated quest demanded an absurd repetitive effort. He would need to swing his sword 10,000 times to get the reward. The protagonist pondered the magnitude of the task before him. He knew he would need total dedication to fulfill that numerical requirement and strengthen his skills. Without wasting time, he firmly adjusted his combat stance. The goal was clear: to complete the exhausting series of movements as quickly as possible, so he could proceed. He entered the dungeon, observing the remains of past battles along the way. The fact that the local boss had already been defeated made that environment strangely safe for his training. The undead warrior maintained absolute focus on his strategy. This was the ideal moment to evolve his abilities without the worry of an imminent surprise attack from a powerful monster. Ray, however, sought confirmation about the next step. She looked back with a slight smile, questioning whether they should really enter those shadows at that moment. Troy,